This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 28. Is Trump right about currency manipulation?
Today on the Debunking Economics podcast, it's currency manipulation for beginners. Donald Trump has had to go at China, Japan and Germany for currency manipulation. Is he right? Or are they just applying monetary policy like everybody else? President Trump reckons they're weakening their currency to make their exports cheaper and giving them an unfair advantage over America. But can they really do that? If so, how? And are they really doing that? Professor Steve Keen is with us again. Of course, it was a big part of Donald Trump's pre-election rhetoric, of course, wasn't it? But has he got a point? I mean, the yuan sank 13% in the 3 years to 2016. That's obviously helping them to sell their goods overseas. So is this a deliberate tactic on their part? And if so, is it unfair currency manipulation, or is it just the natural order of things?
Well, it's a combination of that. I mean, again, as I said, this is what I don't like commenting areas that I haven't done detailed work on. But this is one of those areas. However, the obvious elements behind this are that if you're running a trade surplus, over time you're accumulating foreign currency, and with that foreign currency, you can intervene on the market and buy your own currency, driving up the value of that currency, or you can sell your own currency, and people will buy it because you've got a trade surplus. You're not actually in a weak situation like England, where if you sell, you might not get any buyers. So there's a potential to have what they call a dirty float, and virtually every country in the world, the central bank will worry about its exchange rate, and if it does have the reserves to back itself up, and China and Japan certainly have those reserves, then they'll get involved in the dirty float as well. So that's part of the story. The main one, which matters the most because of its sheer scale of its trade surplus, is Germany. And that's not a currency manipulation that's led to them having that huge surplus. It's the fact that they're part of a currency which is much weaker than the mark would be if the mark still existed. Yeah. And that would have forced, and so that is really, I mean, China and Japan to some extent, you've had with Japan's been industrializing and developing and moving ahead of the rest of the world in technology terms for a long time, and that's been the basis of it maintaining a permanent trade surplus. China's done it by coming from low wages but industrializing rapidly. Germany has already done all that in the past, getting out of the chaos of the Second World War. But what they've done since the euro came in is really benefit out of a currency which devalues their currency as a hypothetical currency compared to the rest of the world, and they're now dragging in as big a surplus, I think, on their own as China.
Yeah, well, so that which points to the whole problem behind the idea of the eurozone, doesn't it? Yeah. But if we look at China, it seems like they can't win, can they? Because I mean, China is investing overseas. If they're investing overseas, then presumably that's going to devalue their currency because there's simply less demand for the yuan because there's less investment opportunity there. I mean, China is looking overseas because there's not enough to invest in locally, isn't that part of them?
They've had the boom that they financed after the financial crisis was hugely financed by domestic credit, and that was basically the central bank and the Communist Party telling private banks, we think it'd be a nice idea if you lent money. And if you the basic response to any Chinese Communist Party directive is if somebody tells you to lend money, you go start throwing at people on the streets. Anybody with a pulse gets a loan. So there's been an enormous stimulus to private spending. Of course, most of that has gone into housing. We've all seen stories about the ghost cities, but also it's gone into office accommodation building, a lot of finance for state enterprises at the local government level. So there's a huge level of spending and purchase of inputs. The huge part of the economy the global economy is stimulated by that credit-based demand in China. But now it is so much classic malinvestment that's gone on that there's no potential demand for housing for potentially for decades if those buildings are all turned into real accommodation. A lot of them are just simply concrete towers. That's removed the potential for demand domestically. The one potential that's left is dramatic infrastructure spending, which of course is state finance. So they're doing that on a grand scale with lots and lots of really impressive high-speed rail going in, and all that sort of state construction. But they're also pushing demand offshore because they're still trying to maintain full employment in the Chinese economy. The last thing they want is to have unemployed Chinese workers being forced to return back to the peasant life they had beforehand, which is feasible because a lot of them working in the coastal cities don't have residential rights there. So that is a real political danger for China, and one way to solve it is massive foreign aid, where that foreign aid says, well, we're going to build a railway, we're going to call this thing a new Silk Road, we're going to build it between China and Europe, going through little places like Kazakhstan. And we're going to provide, we're going to build all the infrastructure, the rail links, the road links and so on, and we'll provide Chinese labour to do it and Chinese money, and we'll operate it afterwards. It's a way of extending the bubble by doing infrastructure spending outside their own economy.
Yeah, and if you're a private investor, if you are a wealthy Chinese businessman or businesswoman and you've got a load of lolly sitting in your bank, where are you going to invest? If you're concerned about investing within China because perhaps the government is over-investing, you're worried about the return you're going to get, you're going to invest overseas, presumably, aren't you? And if you're doing that,
which gives you a capital outflow. So you've got to be selling the yuan and buying American dollars. So you're dumping yuan on the market effectively to get that money overseas. So,
which lowers the value of the yuan.
Which lowers the value of the yuan. So you have all these factors which are not just driven by governments, but also by reactions of individuals to the behaviour of governments in this particular case.
Right. So what does Trump do about it? I mean, if in theory, if there is found to be that China is manipulating its currency, and I don't know how you investigate that, but my understanding is under US law, the US Overseas Private Investment Corp will stop financing any programs in China. But, who's going to lose out in that arrangement? Is China going to go, oh, that's awful, we really don't want to lose that American investment, when they're making all the investments themselves anyway? Yeah,
I mean, China really has done very well out of the last 30 years. I think I told you I went to China in 1981, 82, and was actually there at the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone when they were laying the concrete for the place. So before it became the powerhouse it is now. And the deliberate policy of the Chinese was to get Western technology as fast as possible to pull themselves out of the Mao days, and to also develop a class of Chinese capitalists, by requiring the any American firm to have a Chinese partner, and within 5 years the Chinese partner had to own 50% of the business. And they really deliberately turned the ex-communists and also factory managers into capitalists, and that's where things like Foxconn have come from. So they've built an incredibly effective supply chain system throughout the country, so they can produce even without the wage advantage cost they've still got over the Americans. They've also got supply chain advantages, so they've done extremely well. And to America to attempt to reindustrialize now, it really is the old Sisyphean labor to try to get it to succeed. So Trump he's correct in his analysis of some of the causal factors. And certainly American companies relocating production offshore has been a major contributor to that. Whether his solution is going to apply and be successful, let's say I've got my doubts.
Well, I mean, one of the things he wants to do, because of his concerns over devalued currencies, the fact that it is cheap in some countries, and also because he's concerned about that making companies move overseas and therefore not paying their tax. He talked about it during the campaign, and we wait and see whether he's going to follow through on it. But I think he will. He's going to place tariffs on imports, and that might be as much as 20% on all imports, which is a fairly extreme form of protectionism, isn't it? I mean, and that is
it is, and it shows. The whole argument in favour of free trade is an intellectually barren one, as I think we've talked about that already, maybe in more detail yet again. But because it's been so successful for the wealthy, and that includes Donald Trump, with a massive amount of his own local production offshore. it's something which has caused a huge part of the social conflict we're seeing in the West, where the wealthy, the capitalists and the financiers have done very nicely out of this, and the workers have been screwed. And they're now fighting back through the only weapon they've got, which is the ballot box. But it's ugly, because in this sort of change, it's something like just like a tariff cut is disruptive, as it was for the Australian manufacturing sector back in the 1973 when Gough Whitlam cut tariffs by 25% overnight. So whacking them on is disruptive. And your supply chains, you simply can't, you suddenly make one of your supply chains 25% more expensive, but it's a functional supply chain. On the other side, you give an advantage to a dysfunctional supply chain. You don't necessarily get growth out of that. So it can be something which is going to backfire.
There's always going to be things that you can't make in your country. So, for example, you can't grow bananas in the UK. It's too cold. So, an import tariff will just make bananas, if you were doing it in the UK, will make bananas 20% more expensive. Similarly, there are going to be things that are just uneconomic to produce in the United States that can be produced in other parts of the world.
For example, apparently I've seen claims that the iPhone, if they could move the iPhone production back from China to America, you're talking not because of wage costs, you're talking because of just they don't have the technical supply capabilities at the moment. Even if you paid American workers Chinese wages, you'd still find the iPhone being 20 or 25% more expensive, and there'd be huge delays in actually getting the damn thing manufactured again as you got your tooling up to speed. So it's the sort of thing which happens very slowly, and China's had 30 years. Was it 1980? 30-something years to build that supply chain, to train the engineers, to train people as highly skilled operators of complex machinery. All that stuff takes a long, long time to bring about, and what Trump is trying to do it is in a short, sharp shock approach.
Well, and isn't that going to be very similar to what's happened with the devaluation of the pound in the UK? In that if you've got the idea, because the UK faces the same danger, doesn't it? That they may have to pay tariffs to export to Europe, and the argument is, well, that's not going to be a problem. Argument by some people, because the pound is cheaper, and so that is going to make the exports cheaper, and that's going to be that will be enough to compensate for the European tariffs. Couldn't it go the other way? That if there's this extreme form of protectionism is introduced in the United States, everything from China is going to have a 20% tariff put on it. Then China is just going to have to say, well, okay, we need to sell cheaper. And because there's less demand for those Chinese exports as well, it could lower the value of the yuan, so it becomes self-fulfilling. Guess what? They do become cheaper. Just like the pound became cheaper, the yuan becomes cheaper. It compensates for that tariff. Yeah,
there's feedback effects that I don't think Donald Trump has got his head around, that are going to make some of these things be destructive rather than constructive. And of course, the main thing is that it just takes time for those sorts of changes to flow through. So you might get a 20% advantage in cost courtesy of a devaluation, but you don't have the industries to take advantage of it initially, and it takes years for the investment skill levels to be built up. So it's a slow process, and devaluations need to be significant before they give an advantage. There are arguments that English devaluation through the pound is significant enough to mean that a lot of what would have been sourced offshore can now be thought about it being done domestically. But you've got to have the engineering base and the skill base and the population to do that, and that's been reduced by the last 20 or 30 years of globalization. So there's no denying that there's a problem for me, obviously, about the impact of globalization on the skill levels and the technological capabilities of Western nations. But that doesn't mean it's a simple job to reverse it.
Right. And again, the other consequence, of course, is if he does introduce import tariffs, is that China will respond. They'll just say, well, we won't buy Boeing aircraft and we won't buy iPhones, and we'll stop buying from you guys and see who feels the hurt the most.
Yeah, and that's quite possible. So the classic old trade war effect, which people falsely blame the Great Depression on, it was a reaction. The trade war stuff was a reaction to the Great Depression. It didn't cause the Great Depression, but it would have made things deeper in the transition, and that is partly what's going to come out of this. And of course, it also sets up likelihood, and I'm straying a bit from economics here, but there are some islands off the coast of China that China's being very assertive about, And we have a very pig-headed president with an incredibly pig-headed advisor who believes there should be war between America and China at some stage. Those islands could be the first flashpoint about it.
Yeah, it is scary stuff, isn't it? So
it is.
If you were Trump, and thank God you're not, you're a long way from him. If you believe that this competitive advantage driven by exchange rates in economies like China, how do you tackle that? Is there a policy you can put in place to try and protect your own industry without putting up tariffs?
To some extent, you've got to have some level of protection. This is empirical research supporting this, and Danny Roddick has done some of the best of that research. And we found that every country that has actually managed to industrialize to some degree has protected its domestic industries, but it's also stimulated domestic demand. And like in the case of Japan, for example, after the war, when it was completely, manufacturing capacity completely devastated, you partly had the same sort of version of the Marshall Plan from America, providing some of the reconstruction finance, out of which they bought American technology to start building their manufacturing capability. But they then protected various industries, like, for example, initially the motorbike industry, where Honda came from, from bicycles to motorbikes. And as part of the protection was that Japanese people simply couldn't afford to buy American cars or American motorbikes, so they had to make their own cheap versions. But they had two things going for them. One, they had pressure on the manufacturers saying, we're giving you protection now, but that's going to drop over time. You must become competitive with the West. And secondly, America, in its typical arrogance after the Second World War, thought it was the best of everything, didn't need any advice on how to improve its manufacturing capability, so it completely ignored a certain person called Deming. And Deming had developed the idea of just-in-time manufacturing and the belief that you could actually improve both the quality and the cost of manufacturing by paying attention to retooling and minimizing retooling as much as possible. And he was completely ignored in America, but the Ministry of Industry and Trade in Japan thought that was interesting. They invited him over to Japan, and he was the one who advised the Japanese on how to revise their factories so that over time they'd become competitive with the Americans through minimizing waste. That's got the just-in-time manufacturing process. And lean manufacturing, as it's called, all these sorts of ideas. ISO 9000 has been codified in industrial standards. This stuff was all done by the Japanese using the advice of Deming, and that combination meant over time they became the industrial powerhouse they are now. And it was a mixture of all those policies. Now, if you wanted to reverse engineer the same thing in America, then you have to some extent, say the Buy American program, which he can do at the government level, use that capability deliberately, but also provide pressure on the firms that you're doing it for, saying this is not going to last forever. You have to use this Buy American capability to invest in your local economy, and if you do that, you'll continue getting us buying. If you don't, we won't. So use your buying power rather than using your tariff power.
And you pick your industries, so you don't do anything across the board. You say there's areas where free trade needs to exist because we're just never going to be able to compete. But there's other areas where we need to nurture and develop this industry, and so we'll provide some form of protectionism, whether it's through tariffs or some sorts of incentives or supports locally. But you choose your industries carefully.
Yeah, and again, there is a way to do that. The mainstream economists say you can't do that sort of stuff. That's why I really like the work by the Harvard computing unit called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, because they've done, and I've really advised people to take a look at their research. It's extremely high quality stuff. What they've done is, by looking at the way in which industries develop, they say that you need a diversified industrial structure to begin with, not a specialized one. And then that diversification will, if you look at it over time, you'll find that a lot of new industries are produced by combining ideas from different industries. So if you look at the pattern of industries you currently have and look where the areas you don't have, you can actually work out, can we actually make that industry, can we produce the industry out of our current combinations or not? What's the closest one for us to work for? And use that as a guide as the industries to move into.
Yeah. Okay, very quickly, finally then, just let's look at Europe, because you did mention that, that Germany has this big trade surplus. Greece does not. Germany could do with a stronger currency. Greece, of course, could do with a weaker currency. Unfortunately, they've all just got the one currency. Is there a way you can fix that without breaking up the euro? Is there some way that you can compensate for the fixed currency that exists in the Eurozone and create other measures that accept that there is a cost of living difference from one country to the next, the value of labor is different, the balance of trade is different, the fundamental economics of each country is different? Is there a way you can solve, I mean, this is probably a conversation for another day, but is there another way you can do that while keeping the euro?
There's two ways you could do it. One is using the European Investment Corporation as a way of doing infrastructure investment in the countries which are suffering trade deficits within the euro. That's one of Yanis Varoufakis's original proposals from almost a decade ago now. And that'd be an effective way to go about it. The other is the countries have to set things up so that they have comparable inflation rates, or you have inflation in Germany deliberately being allowed to be higher than inflation in Italy. The major reason why Germany's got this huge trade surplus is that its inflation rate's been lower than the rest of the Europe. They all agreed to a 2% target. Germany hit about 1, France hit 2, and Italy hit 3. What that means is every year, with a fixed exchange rate courtesy of the euro, German industry's been getting a 2% advantage compounded every year over Italian industry, and therefore Mercedes are now much cheaper than Lamborghinis. So that on the huge price advantage, people are buying Mercedes in Italy rather than buying Lamborghinis, or Fiat, and whatever the comparison you want to make, and that's what screwed Italian industry. So that would require Germany to agree to having a higher inflation rate than Italy. What are the odds of that?
0. Yeah. But it would be so the European Central Bank, you're not doing your job until everyone meets your 2% or whatever your target is.
Or for a while you make up for the fact that Germany was 1% below the target and Italy was 1% above. You've got to allow those inflation rates to diverge and allow Germany to have a higher inflation rate. Now that is never going to happen. Politically, that'd be suicide to any German politician who agreed to that. So for that reason, for the inability to accept the cure, we're going to continue with the disease until it ends the patient in a different fashion.
Right. So manipulation or monetary policy, that's the I mean they are inextricably linked, aren't they, really? It's very difficult to say whether somebody is deliberately manipulating or they're just applying a monetary policy for the good of their economy. But I don't know whether we've drawn any conclusion here, apart from the fact it's really complicated. I mean, where does the world go on this? I guess it's, how do we deal with these inequalities of trade? Because at the end of the day, what we all want to achieve is a positive trade balance. Effectively,
which we can't all do. So that we have that's why we had the ideas of limitations on both surplus and deficit nations under Keynes's Bancorp proposal, which we didn't go with. Yeah. And look at the world we've ended up in as a result.
Yeah, and we did talk about that a few weeks back, and it's definitely worth listening to that one if you haven't already. Good to talk, Steve. Catch you again soon.
Okay, mate. Bye.
And there we are, another edition of the Debunking Economics podcast. We'll be back again very soon, in a few days' time, probably with another one. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Dobbie. We'll catch you then.